Survivors, Flood, Mississippi 1927, Chapter 8. Molly strained to hear, turning one way, then the other. The river had widened out again. The east bank was at least a mile away, and she couldn't see the west bank. The dog had to be on the river, but where? "Can you spot it?" she shouted at Garrett. He turned his head. It was getting lighter, and she saw him frown as he craned his neck to look upstream, then down, as she had done. The dog kept howling, but it was impossible to tell where the sound was coming from. The air was too thick with the rushing and rumbling of the river. A mosquito whined close to Molly's face, and she swatted at it. Abruptly the dog fell silent, and Molly caught her breath. Her imagination produced quick, ugly images of the dog slipping beneath the water's surface, for some reason that made her want to cry more than anything else that had happened. But then the dog began to howl again, and she found herself grinning. She glanced at Garrett and saw the relief on his face, too. It wasn't drowned, at least. Molly pointed upstream. "You watch that way," she told Garrett, and he nodded. Clutching the side piece from the drawer beneath her right arm, she worked her way to the downstream side of the raft. The day was coming fast. There were pinkish clouds to the south. Molly rubbed at her eyes, then leaned forward again, trying to pinpoint the howling. A little glimmer of white made Molly tilt her head, staring eastward. It came and went, winking, as the sun cleared the horizon. Instantly there was a shine on the water, a welcome warmth on Molly's skin. The distant shine brightened into a rectangle. "Is that it?" she shouted, pointing. Garrett shaded his eyes, and Molly waited. From when they were little, he had always been able to see farther than she had. She watched his face until he smiled and nodded. "I see the dog. It's riding on boards, or house siding, or something like that. It's smart enough to be lying down." As the minutes passed, Molly watched the dog closely. It was lying now, its head thrown back to bark. She wondered if it could see them. Maybe if they shouted, no, that might make it stand up, and the next stretch of rough water would be the end of it. As she stared, she realized that the distance between them and the dog was closing. The white planks that carried it were in slower water, 100 yards or more to the east. "We're going to end up going right by it," she shouted. "Maybe we can slow the raft down," Garrett yelled back at her. Molly instantly felt the raft react to the dragging pressure of the drawer front. The dog was still pretty far ahead of them, and a long way eastward. She felt the raft crossing the current and grinned at Garrett. "That works like a rudder on a boat. We're turning." The dog set up a fresh wail, and Molly shifted so that she could see. Moving at a slant, they were gaining fast. The water was smoother here. The raft wasn't jolting and jumping nearly as much as it had been before. "I can't hold it much longer," Garrett said. Molly faced him. "I'll take a turn." Garrett sighed and lifted the drawer front out of the water. The raft lurched, and he tipped backward, his hands clutching the makeshift paddle. Molly managed to grab his wrist, and they both regained their balance, breathing hard. "Be more careful," Molly said. Garrett got his left hand beneath the rope and closed his fist tightly. With his right, he pretended to doff an invisible hat. "Yes, ma'am." Molly took the drawer front and positioned herself at the rear corner of the raft as he moved forward. She lowered the board slowly, and was amazed at how hard it was to control, even using the brass drawer pull as Garrett had done. The current was not only incredibly strong, it fluttered and vibrated the smooth wood. The board was like a living thing, just waiting for a chance to break free. "We're doing pretty well," Garrett shouted to her from his new perch on the front of the raft. Molly's right arm was trembling with the effort when they finally got close to the dog. Its float was slick, white-painted planks that looked like they had been torn from the side of a building. They were thin and barely supported the dog's weight. The water sloshed around across the boards from both sides, covering its paws most of the time. The poor animal was wet and bedraggled. It was skinny, too, and shivering. "How are we going to get it onto the raft?" Molly asked Garrett, hoping he had an idea. She sure didn't. Garrett shook his head. "If we could get up to within a couple feet, we could maybe tie our boards together, and the dog could walk across, and—" He trailed off, looking around. Molly sighed, angry at herself for not keeping an eye on the side piece. Somehow the loop of twine had slipped free, and it was gone. "Oh, my Lord!" Garrett was staring downriver. Molly turned. There, less than half a mile ahead, she could see a stretch of water whitened with foam. Now that she was looking at it, she heard it too. Garrett stared, shouting at her, "We don't have time for the dog. We have to get as far eastward as we can. Maybe we can miss the worst of it." Molly turned to see him gesture, his face pale. The dog yowled. It was facing them now, still 30 feet away across the swift, bottomless river. We have to help it, Molly yelled at Garrett. No, he screamed back. There isn't time, Molly. Help me turn the raft. Molly glanced at the dog once more. It had stood up and was hunched forward, poised at the edge of its planks, eyes fastened on hers. Come on, she yelled impulsively. Can you swim? Come on! The dog hesitated a few seconds longer, then plunged into the water. Molly gasped as it sank, then came up again, turned the wrong way. Over here! Garrett yelled at it. We're here! Come on, you can do it! Molly started shouting too. The dog swam frantically for a moment, headed away from them. Then it pivoted in the water, and Molly could see its ears pricked up when it saw them. Swim! She shouted it, crossing her fingers. The dog paddled desperately, crossing the current, its muzzle tipped almost straight up to keep the splashing water out of its nostrils. Its paws flashed, lifting completely out of the water at times when the current shifted, falling from beneath it. Slowly, panting and wild-eyed, the dog closed the distance between them. It's going to make it, Molly thought. It really is. She started to move toward the dog, anchoring one hand so that she could lean out to help it. Molly! Garrett screamed from behind her. She glanced up. The rough water was just ahead of them. In seconds the raft would begin to leap and jolt. She turned to the dog. It was so close now that she could see its whiskers, brown on one side, white on the other. They matched the blotches of color that divided its face. Molly! Garrett screamed again as she leaned out as far as she could, clinging to the rope with one hand. The dog bobbled in the water and went under, coming up a second later, its ears plastered flat, choking. Molly inched toward it, straining. The dog struggled harder, seeing her outstretched hand, its paws working furiously, fighting against the brown water, pulling at it from beneath. Molly glanced ahead. The current was already rougher. She was afraid to lean out any farther. The dog slid beneath the water once more. At that instant Molly felt Garrett's strong hand on her leg. She didn't look at him, but kept her eyes fixed on the terrified animal. She let go of the rope and leaned outward, reaching with both hands. The dog managed to break the surface once more, and Molly grabbed the loose skin on the back of its neck. Pulling the dog onto the raft, corralling it with her legs as she sat up and reaching for the rope, Molly saw Garrett scooting backwards across the logs. They had time to exchange a single glance before they hit the rough water.